Welcome to the Daily Slant. I'm your host, Josh Hayes, and the Daily Slant is powered by Pro Football Focus and brought to you by DraftKings.com. You can find me on Twitter here at Josh Hayes FS. And joining us on today's show is DraftKings Team Pro, Roto Academy founder, co-founder of FantasyLabs.com, and the author of Fantasy Football for Smart People. You can find him on Twitter eating breakfast sandwiches. It's Bales Football. Jonathan Bales, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. What's up, Josh?
So I got to know, what did you have for breakfast today? Because you look like you're in about 10 times better shape than I am right now. So I need to be eating what you're eating.
For breakfast today, I had a breakfast sandwich. I had a sausage, egg, and cheese on a bagel.
Yes.
and then for lunch, I had some Lunchables. So I don't know. I don't know if you want to follow my diet plan.
Well, if it works for you, I'm in. You look like you're in tremendous shape right now. So for anybody who's watching this on YouTube or on Fantasy Sports Network, that's the key. It's Lunchables and sausage, egg, and cheese.
Yep.
I'll get it done for you. All right.
So
let's go ahead.
Only the ham Lunchables, not the turkey. Only the ham.
Okay. Yeah. Higher quality grade of meat is what you're saying. Absolutely. I do prefer the ham myself. So for those of you who may not be familiar with your work and how you got into the DFS industry, can you give us a little background of how you got started in DFS and how that led you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I got started in fantasy sports in general just by writing a book. It was just sort of a hobby of mine, and I thought I had maybe a couple interesting things to say, so I wrote a book that I titled Fantasy Football for Smart People. That is now the name of the series of my books, but it was just, I don't know why I chose. It was just completely random, and I kind of got lucky with why I chose that title. But so I chose that, and it was sort of popular, and I guess it encouraged me to keep writing. And then I had approached a daily fantasy site in 2012. I think it was pretty early. DFS was in its infancy for sure, to write like a strategy guide for their site, and they said no. So I went ahead and did it anyway, and just collected my own data on it, and that's really where I started was writing the books. I thought there might be, it was sort of the time when ebooks were becoming a little bit popular, and people were sort of I think Kindles were becoming very popular, and I thought there was potentially a little niche to carve out there, and so that's why I did it, and just got lucky, I guess, and sort of have got into it more from there.
Yeah, that's great. And that stuff is really taken off. It's awesome content. So you have a chance to check it. I believe those are all available on Amazon and online in Barnes and Noble as well. So great series there. Quick question for you related to that. Were you a season-long player, and did somebody come to you and be like, hey, check out FanDuel, or, let's how did you end up coming across DFS as a fantasy player?
Yeah, I was a season-long player, exclusively season-long, but I played a lot. Like, this was all I wanted to do, was play fantasy. So I think in that year I was in 36 season-long leagues, and it wasn't like the MFL 10s or whatever, where it wasn't like a draft and you're done. It was 30. Yeah, it was 30. It was just crazy.
You're managing 36 waiver wires every day.
It was so stupid too. It was for like no money, but yeah. So then I just found DFS, and I thought I could win, and I couldn't initially, and I got beat pretty good at first, but then I started to play on DraftKings and had a little success there, because I think my philosophy was I was getting killed, and I was like, well, why am I getting killed? I'm good at season long, and these skills should translate, and they do, but you need to sort of like figure out how to translate them. So I just sort of tried to figure out a way that one specific area where I could beat people, and then structure my lineup around that. And I thought I found that with the flex on DraftKings. And so I would try to beat people in the flex, and then started to have a little bit more success or break even or whatever, and then just tested different things and went from there.
Yeah, you know what? This is great for you to hear you say that because that gives me hope as a person who, who likes to play a lot but hasn't had as much success as I would have liked. I feel the same way that you felt probably back then when you were just getting started with DraftKings. In that, I love season long. I've dominated so many of my home leagues, and I've actually played a little bit in some of the like the CBS for money leagues against random people in the public, and we're like, hey, you know what? I'm really good at this. I should kill in DFS. And then you sort of get that rude awakening and understand that it's a little bit of a different skill set. And so some of those things apply. You just have to figure out how to filter and translate that. And I think that's what a lot of people are trying to do, and why we have you here on the show to maybe help us understand that and explain that. Which leads me to my next question here. NFL DFS is really blowing up. I think it's once again it's going to be a record-setting season for DraftKings, for FanDuel, for everybody involved. What do you see that's different this season for 2015, and what are you going to do different, or what should other DFS players be doing different coming into this season?
Yeah, I think things sort of change a lot. I think the thing that we always need to be looking at is the way that sites are pricing players. So those things will change. So last year, for example, DraftKings, I know, changed the way that they priced receivers so that overall receivers were more expensive last year on DraftKings. Whereas compared to the year before in 2013, you should have pretty much always played a receiver in your flex. Arguably, even in cash games, even though they're more volatile, because there was so much value there. They increased the pricing of the receivers last year, and we'll see those same sort of things this year. Things always change, so it really is just about I think evolving and adapting to new trends and pricing, but always being cognizant of the way and methods that the sites are pricing players. I think is really really important. The things that are going into their algorithms, which you can sort of try to reverse engineer, how much they might be weighing receptions, for example, and things like that, and then figuring out where those inefficiencies might lie. And it really does always change, and just adapting to that. And then that's just in terms of sort of projecting players, but in terms of tournaments, everything is always evolving. Where it's a combination of trying to find value in terms of site pricing inefficiencies, but then also trying to find like usable value where the crowd is missing out on things, and that just completely changes all the time based on just different narratives in NFL and the Vegas lines and things like that can affect the way that people perceive players, and trying to adjust to that, I think, is I don't know that there's one way to do it that you're always ahead of the curve, but just like having a process where you're always trying to think ahead, I think, is the most important thing.
I like that a lot, and I was actually that's something I probably was less cognizant of last year when setting my Millionaire Maker lineups. Was I wasn't trying to sort of figure out what's happening in terms of pricing. I was spending all my time trying to figure out who the best play is, and and paying more attention to defensive matchups and getting myself into a good spot against weaker defenses, rather than sort of figuring out where the best pricing values are happening in terms of how sites are pricing players. So that's a great thought, and something that I probably hadn't given enough thought to. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So I guess sort of this all wraps up into overall game theory, especially related to GPPs, and I know that's something that you specialize in. So can you explain some of the basic concepts of game theory that I'm sure are explained in more detail in your book? But so maybe just people who are listening or watching this show now can sort of get a background on how game theory applies to DFS and GPPs, and what concepts are the most important to understand.
Yeah, so I guess fundamentally, I think it's a cash games and GPPs are so much different. So in cash games, like a head-to-head or 50-50, you're primarily just concerned about value. You want to maximize either points or the floor of your team, but you're trying to pretty much just find as much value as possible. Whereas in tournaments, you very much need to be concerned about what other people are going to do. And so the ownership rates are very, very important. And so really you're looking at how a player's ownership rate might compare to his probability of reaching a high ceiling. So Someone like Aaron Rodgers might be a really good play in a given week, but if he's overowned, he actually will offer negative value in tournaments because I think what we need to be concerned about is not just the probability of something happening, but the payoffs to us if something good does happen. I think that's sort of the game theory component of it. So there was a really good quote by another DraftKings pro, Drew Dinkmeyer, Dink piece. When he was in the financial world, he heard a lot. What do you win if you win? And I think that's very relevant to daily fantasy. So we not only we want to win, we want to pick the right players, but we also want to maximize the payoff to us if we're right. And I think that's the most overlooked part of GPPs is maximizing that payoff. And so finding anytime you can hit on a player who is not in a lot of lineups, you're going to sort of maximize that payoff to you if you're right. You can sort up the leaderboards as opposed to if you roster a player who's in 50% of lineups, he's probably the top value or near it. But if you hit on him, you're still competing with 50% of the field. And so balancing that value with ownership, I think, is just critical in tournaments. And I think people are overly focused on value where the majority of the payoff is in focusing on ownership potentially.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something I've sort of learned the hard way throughout baseball DFS this year is that whenever you take a solid cash game lineup that's rostering maybe like the top pitcher, for example, or like you said in Aaron Rodgers an example when he's clearly the top quarterback on the board, which is why you almost never see that lineup win a GPP because the ownership percentage is so high. So you just basically, even if he had a kick-ass game, you're in there with the other 50%, and if the rest of your lineup isn't perfect, you have an even, I guess, smaller margin of error for you to go deeper into a GPP.
Yeah, exactly. You're perfect. Yeah, that's exactly right. So you require perfection from yourself in the other spots where you might deviate from the crowd a little bit more. And baseball is definitely a sport too. I think it's a good comparison to NFL. So baseball is a very contrarian sport because it's so volatile night to night. It's very difficult to project, especially batters, just what they're going to do in a single night of baseball. It's very consistent over the course of a year. But night to night, very, very difficult. It's such an event-based sport. A guy could be crushing the ball and hit a couple of shots to the warning track and he gets out. And so that variance, I think, lends more value to being contrarian. And so the value in going against the grain, I think, is fundamentally related to the predictability of the sport. And football is not as random as baseball, but not as predictable as something like basketball, where players have very high floors. We know LeBron James is not going to score nothing. As Mike Trout might go 0 for 5 in a given night of baseball, or even a top receiver might see only 3 or 4 targets just because he's getting double covered or whatever. So football is sort of in between there, where we can sort of predict it, but for the most part, we kind of suck at it. And I still think we should emphasize ownership because it is so difficult to predict week to week.
Those are all interesting things that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily looking at for their GPPs. And I think it's a great advertising point for the casual player too. And I sort of mentioned this to Renee, who wasn't able to join us this week, but she'll be back on the show next week, is that when people see like Dink Piece play Niall Davis and win $1 million, or Marquise Wilson and, a third wide receiver, and you're like, are you kidding me? You played those guys and he won, and he's like, I need to get in there on DraftKings. And a lot of people don't understand the rationale behind rolling players like that who have extremely low ownership and or at least the casual players and not. And so we're sort of trying to understand that process. And my question to Renee last week was, how many home run GPP plays do you need in your lineup to optimally to sort of take down a GPP? And her number was 4. Do you feel like that's about the right number for like extremely low ownership guys in your lineup, or would it be a little bit different for you?
It's a really good question. I think it just depends. I think it depends on the way that I sort of structure it is, if I have a very obvious value, even if I think he's going to be in a lot of lineups, I'm still going to play him. So the typical example is if a backup running back comes into the starter gets hurt, a backup comes in, he's going to get 20 carries or whatever. He's min priced. You can't fade that player. So I'm going to play him pretty much regardless of ownership. But anytime that I have a player rated very highly in terms of, I think he's maybe a top 5 value at his position, and I think he's going to be under-owned, then I'm going to potentially go all in on that sort of players where I might have him. I might have him in every lineup if he's a good enough value. I might have him in 70% of lineups and tournaments or something like that, and just sort of roll the dice in that way. I don't think you need to be overly contrarian in the same way that you do in baseball, because there's not the same lineup overlap. So in baseball, there's stacking where you can play 6 batters from the same team, and it creates so much lineup overlap that there's even more incentive to be contrarian. I don't think you need that, but I do think, I do think that you definitely need contrarian elements, and it still just depends on a variety of factors, how your values come out in a given week. If you think you can be naturally contrarian and still derive value from your lineup, the types of leagues you're entering. So if you're in queues where only the top 1 or 2% or only the top person or the top 2 get paid, then there's more incentive to be contrarian. If your goal is to primarily cash and then see what sort of upside you can get on top of that versus trying to win, then you might be less contrarian. So it just depends on a variety of factors, I think. I wouldn't say that I'm always looking to fit a specific number of under-the-radar plays into my lineup.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. So it's basically it can change week to week based on the number of values that are available or the type of GPP or queue that you're playing, and sort of to that fact, if there's a couple natural plays that are, Jerick McKinnon, Adrian Peterson goes out for the season, and Jerick McKinnon's minimum salary price, and you have to play him, that sort of eliminates one of your contrarian plays off the board because he's a must play. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that'll dictate your other decisions. And then another big thing is just the type of league that you're in terms of who do you think you're going to be facing. If I'm in a $2 or $3 GPP, I might just play my cash game lineup because I think that people aren't going to be as price sensitive. They're not really going to be able to spot value in the same way that if I'm in a $300 or a 1K or something like that, I'm pretty sure that the players in there are pretty good. They know who the good values are. And so there's going to be more lineup overlap there and more incentive to be contrarian against really good players because I can better predict who they're going to have in their lineups.
That makes a lot of sense for me too. So you can sort of build in a safer floor in some of the smaller GPPs because you think there would be, I guess, more mistakes made per se. Yeah. And in the tougher competition, the higher buy-ins, there's a lot more, I guess, incentive or room for you to go outside the box in order for you to overtake a lot of the people who are going to be in on some of the same values that you are. Does that sound correct? Okay, exactly. Great. All right, so my next question here is, for a lot of the people who are starting out, I mean, ESPN's doing a great thing with DraftKings and sort of saying, hey, if everybody joins your season-long league and you finished among the top among all these season-long players in week 1, we'll give you an extra $1 million to split between you and your league. So it looks like to me there's going to be a bigger push than ever for casual players to make the transition over to NFL DFS for week 1 on DraftKings and sites like FanDuel. Where should they start? What's the best way to get acclimated so they don't, have to go through some of the growing pains that I or other players did trying to figure out DFS on our own?
Yeah, so I know DraftKings has beginner leagues, so I would start there for sure, just to play other people who are new. And then always, I think you should be playing as many lineups as you can at lower stakes. So I think it's better to play 10 lineups at $1 than it is to play a single $10 or 20 lineups at $5 than it is to play a single $100. First of all, you just have more bullets, so you can get just luckier. If you hit on something, you give yourself more exposure to that. But also the competition isn't as stiff. So generally, I think at anything maybe lower than $20, you're probably facing a lot of new players, and so you just are going to have a much higher ROI playing in those leagues. So I think that's most important. And then in terms of I think that people suggest to naturally, when you're starting to play cash games. I think that makes sense. I think that if you're going to play cash games early, you should play 50-50s because it gives you the ability to study other lineups. So if you're in one 100-man 50-50, you can study 99 other lineups. And so if there's players who you know are good players, even to enter maybe a higher stakes, and then just for the ability or just to look at a league that you're not even in, to study those lineups and reverse engineer how they allocated their cap and why these players did what they did. I think that there's a ton of value in that. I don't think that you necessarily have to place X% of your bankroll into cash and Y% into GPPs. Like people say, I think that's just, what your goals are. Are you trying to learn DFS and become profitable and long-term profitable and be a cash game player? Are you trying to just hit on something and have fun? I think that's just a matter of personal preference, but I do think that there's a lot of value in joining leagues and then studying lineups of the top players.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you bring up, because I sort of took that from the poker world as a former online poker grinder, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was getting routinely getting my butt kicked. So what I would do is take a look at the people who are ranked at the top of the leaderboard, find their usernames in any of those games that I was playing in with them together in those tournaments, and then watch them play, watch what they did, and sort of use that as your cheat sheet for what generates success. And I think you can do that because chances are, even in the smaller GPPs, you're going to have people who are successful more often than not, and driving lineups that are going to be consistent winners or cashers because of the level of experience that they have. And so you can sort of use that as your sort of key to your lineup. You're like, well, I didn't think of playing Jeff Cumberland this week. Not that you would ever play Jeff Cumberland, but
yeah,
just as an example, figure out a way to look outside the box, because I'm always a little bit surprised when I looked at somebody else's lineup that finished towards the top, and I have to ask myself, why didn't I think about using that guy? And so if you can get to that part of the process and sort of reverse some of the things that you did with their process, then I think that's where there's some serious opportunity to grow as a DFS player. So I want to talk to you about the Fantasy Labs lineup optimizer. So this is, I think, your baby, your brainchild, partnered up here with over at Pro Football Focus. So if you are a Fantasy Gold member, and you will definitely have access to this. This is a great tool for you to build DFS lineups in. By the way, if you're not a Fantasy Gold member yet, all you have to do is make a $10 deposit through the link on the main page on Pro Football Focus /fantasy. There, it's normally a $29.99 membership for all things rolled together with the draft kit and the premium content, along with the toolkit and the lamp optimizer. But there's a great way. I mean, we're talking about playing on DraftKings, so you might as well get the freebie that way. So just taking a look at the lineup optimizer here, can you take me through what went into this, how you guys built it, and how fantasy players should be using this throughout the season for FanDuel, DraftKings, and it looks like it'll also be available for Yahoo.
Yep. Yeah, so we might add another site or two as well. But yeah, so the optimizer, the one that we have up on Pro Football Focus, is based on Mike's projections. So basically, we're just optimizing a lineup for one of the daily fantasy sites based on his projections. So we just take what he thinks is going to happen, compare that to the salary, and then run a bunch of simulations, and then create the best possible lineup for pretty much for cash games, I think, based on the Pro Football Focus projections in a given week. And then we have a bunch of other data there that we have at Fantasy Labs, like consistency and things like that. So that some proprietary statistics. So consistency is we have every player's historic salary and performance on each site since they've been running, and then we can look, so we know sort of if a player costs say $5,000 on DraftKings, how many points he should score, and if he reaches that number, then we would consider that a consistent performance, and then we can judge consistency and upside and sort of downside based on those numbers that are salary adjusted, which I think is something unique.
You know what? And I want to say that I've tested out multiple lineup optimizers with more than mixed success or less than mixed success across different daily fantasy sites. And the thing that stands out about this lineup optimizer is you can actually click on a guy's name and you look at the price, you see him in your lineup, and then you can take a look at exactly what's going in to the ratings. You have projected ceiling, consistency, opponent rating, a bargain rating, upside, Vegas score, and they're all given, I think it's a 0, 1 to 100 score, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that separates this from everything else is like nobody usually doesn't want to give away their secret sauce or exactly what's behind the numbers, but this it can do nothing but make you a better player when you're truly understanding why the optimizer or why this player is rated for a certain projection in the Fantasy Labs optimizer for a given week. So this is great stuff. Do you guys have any concern about putting out all this data? I imagine it would be hard to reverse engineer for most people anyhow, but I think it's something unique that no other optimizer or lineup projector does.
Yeah, in terms of the exact data itself, no, I don't think that. I think that's pretty proprietary. I'm not too worried about that. In terms of just releasing information, that's good for me personally or for other daily fantasy players. Yes, I think it's probably limit. I think it cuts into my profit short term for sure. I'm personally just more concerned about long term and establishing a presence in DFS. And I think if I didn't do this, someone else is going to do this no matter what. And so I'd rather be on the side that can make money from it. But yeah, we give a lot of information about what goes into these ratings. But in terms of so we have the projections on Pro Football Focus, but on Fantasy Labs, the player ratings, you actually determine those. So we just allow users to create models. So they just weigh different stats. And so you can weigh upside and you can weigh the opponent strength, and you can weigh the Vegas lines and however you like, and then create a model. And then we back test that for you. And so people are pretty much creating their own models for the most part, and then optimizing a lineup based off of that.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that there was that much customization available on Fantasy Labs. So that's really cool. And I've been sort of toying around with this here as well. For instance, there's a lot of plug and play ability with this. So for instance, if I don't want to use, an interesting thing according to Mike's projections, by the way, that if you get a chance to check out this lineup optimizer, the top quarterback on the board for week 1, it's not Aaron Rodgers and it's not Andrew Luck. So just sliding down here along the list, if I wanted to use, for instance, Ryan Tannehill against Miami, I can X out the current quarterback at the top, plug him in, and now that I have him locked into my lineup, just hit the refresh button, and then you have a whole new optimized lineup based on the cost savings that you were able to generate from bumping down your lineup down to Ryan Tannehill. So my next question for you here with this lineup optimizer is, how much tweaking do you recommend that people do with this lineup optimizer versus the default numbers that are going to be projected week to week?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that you should be doing potentially a lot for a couple of different reasons. Number one is if you're going to enter this in a tournament, you don't want the same lineup that other people are going to have. So you're going to want to tweak it for that reason. But secondly, the optimizer doesn't. It has blind spots. It doesn't know there's some subjectivity that goes into it. It just can't. It's only as good as the projections, and Mike's projections are probably the best that there are, but still they're not perfect. He makes mistakes, and he's also doing only a median projection for a player. Like, this is the most likely outcome. But if you're in a tournament, for example, you might not care about that. You only probably care about players who have exposure to a certain ceiling or a certain. You're always one thing that I think is important. So if you click on any of the player names in the optimizer, we have sort of a distribution of how many points they could score, and that's like a range of outcomes, and we calculate that based on like certain predictors of volatility. So Matt Forte has less volatility, for example, than Jeremy Hill because he catches more passes and he's less dependent on game script and touchdowns and things like that. And so I think a huge part of it is trying for DFS purposes is trying to give yourself exposure to certain ranges of outcomes. And so with the optimizer, it might suggest someone like for example, I don't know, Julian Edelman, because he's a great value for cash games. But if you're in a tournament, you might not want Julian Edelman. You might want someone like Vincent Jackson or Mike Evans in your lineup, and maybe they're the same price. And so there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into it. So I think it's very valuable to use the optimizer just to see what mathematically the best lineup looks like, and then sort of adjust it there based on your goals, dependent on what types of leagues that you're in.
Now, what if I'm a Browns fan? If I ever see like a Browns player make it into the projection, should I just ignore that and delete that
Yes,
guy?
immediately X out.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to make sure because I feel like there might be like that's like a way to catch errors in the system in the projection. If you ever see,
If any Brown is in there, then we made a mistake. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. As a longtime Browns fan, I know that at least I have a fail safe for myself when building these projections. So, wanted to quickly touch on Renee's article that we planned on mentioning, but we'll cover more next week on our next Wednesday show of the Daily Slant. But she basically has a great article series available on ProFootballFocus.com/fantasy. It's called Intro to Four Downs DFS, and the second down article basically talks about the importance of pairing your quarterback with the number one wide receiver, particularly in tournaments. Now, maybe you can speak to how important that is for you. How often are you doing that in a lot of your GPPs? And if there's any scenarios in which that doesn't make sense and you don't pair the wide receiver one, or you go that much farther and pair the wide receiver one and the wide receiver two, for example. So
yeah,
you can talk about that.
Yeah, great question. Also related to the optimizer, because the optimizer currently doesn't recognize correlations. We have a couple very basic ones in, like don't play a player versus a defense, so it won't give you that. But quarterback receiver, for example, if you really like a certain pairing, you would lock those guys in and then optimize around that. And so I think that that's a powerful way to optimize a lineup based around certain guys who you naturally like as a stack. But quarterback receiver is the most common pairing. So last year on DraftKings, 38% of tournament lineups stacked a quarterback with one receiver, and that was the most popular combination. I use it, I would say, I stack in some way, maybe in 80% or 85% of GPP lineups. I think for the most part you can stack and still be contrarian. There's not really that much lineup overlap. It's not like stacking an offense in baseball. You can go with Rodgers and Cobb in week one and still have a pretty unique lineup around that if you'd like to. So there's not it's pretty standard, I think, to stack. It increases your upside more than the downside that you're taking on potentially, and it really does give you a lot more upside. The stacking, the pairing that I like quite a bit more than other people use is quarterback and two receivers. I think that it's standard to think that maybe there's not as much upside there because the receivers could potentially be cannibalizing one another in terms of scores and things like that. But I think there is enough upside. I think that if you're targeting the right types of offense, potentially those in games that are projected to be high scoring, maybe shootouts and things like that, that a quarterback receiver combination does offer a ton of upside, and also it's unique. So I think it was in only 4% of DraftKings tournament lineups last year. So you can potentially increase your upside and then create a unique lineup on top of that, all in one.
Is there any ever scenario where you're like all Green Bay Packers, Eddie Lacy, Cobb, Jordy? I know that's I don't even know if that's necessarily possible because I haven't tried it. In a full like 4-man stack with two wide receivers and the running back and the quarterback. But is that ever viable? Can you even ever make the pricing work out with like min salary players across the board and one of the worst defenses?
No, you can do it. I did it last year actually in a game. I had Cutler, Forte, Jeffrey, and Marshawn. I thought it made sense in that. I think it would be like very specific situations. You would have to have a pass catching running back probably because you're betting on the receivers to score, or else you could have like an Edelman. You might do it like a Brady, Edelman, Gronk, and a running back or something like that, and then you'd be betting on the running back to score and Gronk to score, and then Edelman to catch a bunch of passes. No, I think that potentially you can do that, but I do think once you start the quarterback and receiver production is always correlated. Quarterback and running back, for the most part, is an inverse correlation where a rushing touchdown is bad for everyone in the passing game. That's not good for the teammates. Whereas quarterback and receiver production is always correlated. If you have those guys, you're getting double points. And so I think that you do cut into your upside a little bit, but in certain instances, I would potentially stack an entire team, and then you're just sort of hoping, they score 40+ points, basically.
Gotcha. So a lot tougher to do, and it's not something that's nearly as common, but could make sense in the right scenario. Is sort of what you're looking for there.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it too much, and it needs to be the right type of running back for sure.
Gotcha. All right, a couple of sort of questions before we head on out of here, John. First one is from our own Russell J. Clay. He says, "How are you approaching Green Bay players in Week 1 for GPPs with the salaries already out?" I think it's actually a little bit more interesting of a question now with Jordy Nelson out of the lineup. And then, how many lineups do you like to put into a single tourney?
The Packers question. I won't be fading that at all. I know that people are going to be all over it, and I will too. The player who really interests me a lot is Janis, because I think now I think Cobb gets a little bit of a bump, maybe not as much as people are expecting. Adams gets an obvious bump where potentially you just can't even fade him. But Janis is a player who can score, I think, at a high rate potentially, and there's going to be some touchdowns that need to be made up for in that offense, where you're looking maybe at their running a little bit more with Eddie Lacy, and then throwing to a guy like Janis in the red zone, and potentially the tight ends too, Rodgers and Corliss. But so that's sort of my take there. But that's Adams in particular. I think is so low that that's one of those situations. Even though he's a receiver and their production is volatile, that I won't fade that. I'll have that in for sure in my tournament lineups. And then in terms of how many lineups I play in a given week, that just depends also. I think the lineup count doesn't actually matter as much as people think. I think what matters is the how much money you have in play versus your total bankroll, and then how you allocate that money and how much exposure you have to certain players. So many times I might play only 5 lineups, and because I feel like I have the perfect amount of exposure that I want to certain players. So, for example, we'll just take Adams. Let's say that theoretically I thought he was going to be in 70% of Week 1 lineups. I don't think he'll be in that number at all. But if he were, I would think he's overowned. But that wouldn't mean that I want 0 exposure to him, because he's an obvious value, and so I might use him almost as a hedge, where I say, okay, I want Devontae Adams in 20% of my lineups, and I sort of construct how much of my money I want on each player, and then develop lineups around that, and then figure out how to enter tournaments to get that perfect amount of exposure. And so I think that the overall money and the player exposure, how much money you have on each player, matters more than the lineup count.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense there. And next question we have from Brenton Cianci. How much of a disadvantage are casual players are at, would you say, in tourneys like the Week 1 Millionaire Maker? And are they better off just playing in single entry if they plan on only firing one bullet?
No, I mean, it depends. If you want to win $2 million on a $20 entry, then probably go ahead and compete against the big boys, I guess. I think everyone wants they want these big prize pools, but then they don't want multi-entry. But you can't have one without the other. They get paid for with a multi-entry. And the other thing that's overlooked with multi-entry is that each subsequent entry from someone is necessarily worse than the other, or they think it is. So there's a level of optimality or whatever. Each lineup is suboptimal compared to the one before it. And so I think if you have a single entry, that should be your most optimal entry. You should be probably plus CV with that single entry. So no, I think that you should. I don't think that you're at a huge disadvantage. I actually think that you're have a higher probability of cashing for sure in some of these multi-entry tournaments, just because people with multi-entries are incentivized to diversify more and go against high-value players. And the single-entry ones are potentially easier to win. Maybe there's more incentive to be contrarian, but it's harder to cash and be sustainably profitable in those potentially. But no, I think multi-entry in general is really, really a good thing for the industry. And I think a thing that's overlooked with the people putting in a lot of entries is they're also taking on a lot of risk.
A large amount of
So
risk.
when you have you're taking on the same amount of risk, and so those things overall, I think, end up being a net positive for daily fantasy.
Yeah, I mean everybody's excited about playing for 10 million, but people are like, "Hey, I don't want,
Yeah,
Jonathan, 444 lineups against me." I was like, "Well, you can't have it both ways, buddy. If you want 2 million, you got to let the big boys put up a lot of the share. They're paying for a good portion of the prize pool, much more than
yeah.
bigger percentage than you are. So they're getting what they deserve, and you get what you deserve with the number of entries that you fire out yourself
And
too.
you truly do. Anyone really has a shot to win any single week. It really is. There's no dead lineups really, unless you just are starting people not playing. Anyone can truly win, and to have that, I mean, that's amazing. You can put $20 in on DraftKings and win $2 million in one day. That's incredible. And so to have that, we definitely multi-entry is something that has allowed for that.
Yeah, Odell Beckham Jr. Week 5, coming off the injury. Tell me how many people were on that guy. You know what I mean? Or right off the hammy as supposed to be the number 3 wide receiver in that offense. I told everybody don't pick up that guy in season long. I was like, he's injured. He's a rookie. Needs to get acclimated to the offense. Yeah. So you're totally right. Anything can definitely happen in fantasy. Thanks for joining us here, Jonathan. Before we let you go, can you let us know what's coming up for you? What's next? What you're working on?
Just working on the NFL product at Fantasy Labs and running Roto Academy, which is a DFS education platform at Roto Grinders. And yeah, that's it. And I'm on Twitter at Bales Football.
Yeah, we'll definitely check you out. And he makes himself more than available for Twitter questions and help for DFS advice. A lot of great stuff over at Roto Academy. I'm a Grinders member too, and I've had a chance to check it out. There's some free content for you there as well, so it's not all pay to play. You can definitely check out the free content and see if it's at your taste. And don't forget to check out the books, especially Fantasy Football for Smart People, now available anywhere you can buy an online book. And we thank you for coming on, Jonathan Bales at Bales Football. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
All right, and that's going to do it for today's show. Don't forget you can subscribe for PFF Radio on iTunes, listen on Stitcher, Blog Talk Radio, and watch the show on YouTube and the Fantasy Sports Network. We'd like to thank Jonathan for joining us and sharing his time. As always, we'll catch you here next week, every Wednesday, along with Renee Miller, back for the Week 3 preseason show. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you next time.